Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. I'm really glad you're here today. The window is open, the door is open, the dogs are here, my husband and son are out, they'll be coming home soon. I guess I just wanted to record. I want to talk to you today about relationships and struggles in relationships and expectations and how we work on our healing and our wounding. To tell you the truth, I recorded this episode and listened back to it, and I have never listened back to an episode and not released it. Well, that's not true. I have done that once or twice before. There are a couple things that are going on. I had somebody that I'm really close to have some concerns about me talking about things that go on in our relationship. And when we struggle, I often would say, hey, do you want to record an episode around this? We just see things really differently. And we had a very long discussion about this. This is someone who doesn't listen to the podcast unless I ask her to. But we're on social media, so if I do promotions or do audiograms, she often has a heads up about what I'm talking about. I'm really struggling about how much to talk about because my feeling is I'm really comfortable talking about quite a number of things, as you know, if you're a longtime listener. And although in the end, she said that it's fine for me to talk about whatever I need to. After recording this episode, I was thinking if I were her and I was listening to it, I don't know how comfortable I would feel. And really what my thought is, and oftentimes my husband, like before he would golf, we'd get into a tiff or something. And I would tell him, like, go tell your friend what a terrible wife I'm being. Like, I'm fine with it because I know that I get emotional about things and I get angry and upset. And because I'm a verbal processor, I really need to talk about what's going on with me. And my husband is not that way. When my friend and I were in this process of trying to figure out how I was going to navigate the podcast, what did she need? My thought was if she had a podcast, I just probably wouldn't listen to the episode because I think it would be upsetting to me. Her perspective was, y'all are getting my perspective and not hers, and that's not really fair. Ultimately, I'm really the one that gets to decide. And I'm very clear that my intention for this podcast is I want people to have a sense of connection and belonging and to know that I want you to know that you're not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about sharing when I struggle, because you've written into me. You've said you're in my head. How did you know that? And the content that I talk about, I feel really comfortable talking about. I struggle. I'm a wounded healer. Doesn't matter if you're a therapist, if you're a coach. If you're going to be alive and you're going to be having vulnerable relationships, you're going to struggle. So I'm really trying to navigate through this, and I'm not even sure how this episode is going to turn out because I want to talk about my perspective. So I think here's what I'm going to say. You're going to hear my perspective. It's biased. I have some wounding. I have a lot of injury and hurt around this. And if I were to wait until I worked it all out, there's a good chance that I wouldn't be interested in recording anymore. Part of my passion and my creativity, I've paused because of the dogs. I got feedback from a listener or two that the dog's barking was really jarring. So I'm going to do my best with this, but you're just going to have to hang in there with me. Part of my creativity and my passion is that when I'm having strong feelings about something, I want to sit down and record. And if I wait until I'm not in the situation anymore, I just don't have that passion. Okay, you don't know this, but I took a break. I got the dog. I brought her in here, so hopefully it will be a little bit more quiet. We'll just go with it. When we talk about relationships, especially now during COVID, if you're a highly sensitive person, if you have wounding, which most of us have that listen to this podcast, I don't know, that's not a fair assumption to make. The people that connect with me have wounding. Relationships are going to be more tenuous. They're going to be more difficult. What I'm hearing from clients right now is if you have a breakup, if you're grieving, if your needs are higher for connection, a lot of people right now are just in survival mode with COVID, and they just don't have the availability that they may have had prior to COVID. And that's really hard when we have a high need to connect and we have expected people to be there for us and they're not able to. And if you have a breakup, if you're grieving, your needs are going to be higher than normal. And it can really be a very disheartening time when you're going through a crisis and you reach out to people and they're not available. Sometimes they're just not available because of COVID, because of whatever. And sometimes people start finding out that they're really far more available to the people in their lives. And when push comes to shove and they need someone to be present for them, the people in their lives don't have that capacity. That's a real tough one. I've really been thinking a lot about this whole concept of relationships and what is it that we tend to stay in relationships when they're not working for us and it makes it hard for us to leave. And how do we figure that out with our high levels of empathy? Often we either have empathy for the shortcomings that the other person has because we get it, or there are parts of the relationship that really work for us and we end up making room for the parts that don't work. I'm in the middle of figuring this stuff out. And so I really am just sharing with you from this place that I'm at. What I can tell you that I've been talking about with clients is really looking at the relationships and trying to assess, is this a relationship that has reciprocity? It's not always going to be 50-50. Sometimes it's 70-30. Sometimes it's 30-70. But you want that fluidity that's going on. The other thing we want to look at is, does the person or the relationship have the capacity to handle our feelings, our feedback, our need to process, our need to talk about things, our need to think about things, our need to come back to something because we need time to process and think about it? This is just how we're wired, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with us. And this can be difficult to tease out. When we have wounding, when the other person has wounding, that gets overlaid and we can take things personally. What people may hear is that we're criticizing them, that they're all good or they're all bad, or that they always do something, they never do something. If we have wounding and we have hurts from childhood and we want people to show up in a way that maybe our parents weren't able to show up for us or our caregivers, we put those expectations on them. And no matter what they do, it's never going to be okay. And this is true for me. And think about this in your relationships. My relationships that are current, that are new within the last few years when I've done a lot of healing are incredibly healthy. I don't have expectations about when people show up for me, how they show up. I know that these folks care about me. They love me. They have good intentions for me. And so when we have bumps or hiccups or they're not available, I'm really okay with it. If I have a relationship that has a lot of history in it, an older relationship, these are the relationships where I tend to get my feelings hurt. I tend to have, here's my narrative. I'm not saying this is what's going on. I can't show up and talk about my feelings. You don't want to hear what's going on for me. You don't want me to process. If I tell you I'm feeling hurt or disappointed, it brings up stuff for you. And then you get defensive and then I don't feel like you can be here for me. The reality is I'm a grown grass woman. Take away the GR. And while I have a lot of wounding and attachment injuries from my childhood, I can manage fine today whether people show up for me, whether they're able to respond to me, whether they attune with me or not. My survival does not depend on people showing up for me a certain way. When I was younger, my survival depended on other people. And I think that those are some of the injuries and wounds that we bring into the present. And we forget that we can manage fine if people do not meet our needs. And with this relationship that I'm having some bumps in, I'm just in the thick of it. I'm just in the thick of it. And I can see where the injuries are. And again, I want to be really clear. This is about my process. I've talked to you about my mom. We've done a tremendous amount of healing. She lives with us. I'm really okay talking about this. When I was young, she was a single parent. She was very anxious. I don't know how she did it, to be honest with you, but she could not tolerate my feelings. If I had to cry or I had feelings, I had to go to my room. There was a chalkboard I could write my feelings on outside of my door. I don't think I ever did. I tended to be a door slammer, and we had an alley and I loved to break glass. I remember once throwing a brush in my room and breaking it and me feeling devastated and thinking like I'm never going to break anything I care about again. But I loved breaking glass in the alley. I was an angry, rageful child that acted in. So nobody ever saw that stuff. I was very compliant, but inside I was just angry as all get out because I didn't feel seen and heard. And so my mom really was not able to meet quite a number of my emotional needs. There were other needs that she met just beautifully. In this current relationship, the narrative that I'm carrying forward is I don't feel seen and heard sometimes. I feel like it's not okay to talk about my feelings. It's not okay to process. I have some judgments about where I feel like this other person has some wounding. It's not my business, but there's almost a protective factor that when we have a blip in a relationship, we kind of need to do some sort of an assessment of, is this me? Is this them? Is it both of us? And we're going to have some judgments. So I'm just owning that. As I'm working on looking at this relationship and healing, the part of me that's very young that was really, what I want to say is that she's really mad at this friend. This inner part of myself is really mad at this friend for not showing up and seeing me and making me feel loved and secured and embracing me. It's not her job. It is not her job. I repeat, I'm an adult now. And if I have those unmet needs from childhood due to childhood emotional neglect or having a parent that was emotionally immature that couldn't meet my needs, and I'm an adult now, my responsibility. I want to be very clear. And when I took some time to really work with this young part of myself, I was talking to her about, you're really mad at your mom and you're mad at me because I haven't been there and shown up for her in the way that she needs to. And I've really put it on this external relationship. Now, I have other relationships right now that feel incredibly satisfying where I can show up and talk about what's going on. I feel seen and heard. I can talk about feeling disappointed and it doesn't activate the other person's stuff. And that's beautiful. And this is really what we want to strive for. And when we have these other relationships that have more history, more wounding, we have some choices, and it's a lot harder to stay in it and try and figure it out and work it through and figure out, how do I attend to my healing and my wounding so that I can show up not having these expectations? Because every time I feel hurt or angry or disappointed, it creates suffering for me. I can't tell you at this point, does it mean that I end the relationship? Does it mean I figure out where my wounding is? What I do know is that when we have wounding and we don't heal it, chances are it will show up the same way in other relationships. What you might do is take a look at your relationships and the ones that aren't working. What is it that you feel about those relationships and how people are or aren't showing up for you? Oftentimes it's reflective of two things. One, where we need to do healing, or we continue to choose people that don't have the capacity to meet our needs. We often pick people that are like our parents because we have this unconscious desire to work things through. And the way that we work it through is trying to redo that relationship. And I can certainly see where I've picked female friends who do a lot of mothering for me, where I can get a lot of support and assistance, and relationships where I tend to do nurturing and mothering. And it's not clearly one thing or the other, but because I'm suffering right now, I'm trying to tease out, what do I need to do in this relationship? It's not easy work. And I'll be honest with you, like I'm feeling grief. I'm feeling sadness. I'm missing the connection. And today I was thinking, I really want to connect with, my friend, and I want to talk about how I'm feeling, and I'm not really sure what it is that is working and not working in the relationship because we show up differently, and I'm a processor and it's tapping on that part of me that's feeling wounded, like maybe I'm not supposed to do this, and wanting to have the boldness in my life that I should be able to show up and be fully me in relationships. And if it doesn't work for the other person, is that really my responsibility? And if somebody has limitations, how do I bring parts of me to the relationship knowing that I can't go certain places in relationships? I don't have an answer for you. I'm in the thick of this and in the middle of it, and I'm just trying to sort it out. One of the things that I hear often from my clients is, and this was true for me, if you have a high need for connection, we often get into relationships with people without really thinking about what is it that's important to me to have in a relationship? What are the things that are must-haves and what are the deal breakers? And often when we just connect with someone and it feels good, that's great. And then when we hit a rough spot, a bumpy point, COVID, conflict, and then we start seeing the differences in how we process or how we communicate, then we're not really sure what to do. And we don't know if we should stay in the relationship or leave the relationship. Can we work through things? One of the things that I've really started implementing in my newer relationships, and I think this is why they're so satisfying, is I'm pretty upfront from the beginning. And it's either Brene Brown or Glennon Doyle Melton talk about when you meet somebody at first, they're not meeting you, they're meeting your representative, which is the nice, shiny, polished version that's very well put together. It takes 6 months to a year to get to know somebody, to really get to see who they are. And what I've really been practicing is to talk about the things that are very real to me in the beginning. And I've talked to you about this with Jen Perry, talking about that I had a reaction when she was late to our first appointment. As it turns out, it really wasn't about her being late. It's about, do I matter? Do I care? And when we talked about that, then I don't have an issue with whether she shows up or not. And it's really interesting that I've talked about this too with Jen Perry. Sometimes I don't hear from her for a couple of days. She's very busy. But because I can go to her and tell her, I'm feeling like I want to pull back. I'm feeling like I haven't heard from you, and we can talk about it. I know that she takes me in her heart when I don't hear from her. These are partially attachment injuries. When we can talk about, I'm still important to you, I still matter to you, then if I don't hear from her, it's not a sign of love, whether she's reaching out to me or not, and I hold that connection. And in this other relationship, and I'm just using this to share my perception, my friend said, gosh, I'd really love it if you would, feel comfortable poloing and not waiting until I respond, because I poloed her and a couple days later she responded. And so for me, it was about pacing, just kind of going back to, I'm playing tennis, so here I am waiting for her to respond, and she's playing chess. Not a judgment, just how I'm trying to conceptualize things. And what I shared with her is, I feel like I'm sitting in a box for 3 days until you take me out to play with me, and it doesn't feel good. And really, that's about my sense of connection and attachment. I'm not saying that she's doing anything, but if you hear how I feel in my relationship with Jen, because we're able to talk about this, I know that I'm important, I know I matter, we can talk about this attachment injury that I have. I feel secure when there's space, because I also know I can talk about how I'm feeling if those things come up. In this other relationship, when I talk about not feeling seen and heard, or being disappointed that I haven't heard from my friend, this activates something in her and she feels like she's not doing it right. So this is a place where our wounding kind of collides with each other, and it makes it really challenging. Nobody's right or wrong. If I were to work through my attachment injury, then I could feel solid showing up regardless, that I can polo 1, 2, 3 times before hearing back from her. But because I'm bringing my wounding into this relationship, it's just making it messy and hard. The other thing that's making it hard right now is we're just under more pressure and stress with COVID. If you're in the United States, with the upcoming elections, globally, this pandemic, the loss, the change, people are having more anxiety and depression. It's taking a toll on us. And I think the longer it goes on, sometimes it's easy to feel like, well, I've kind of adjusted to this new normal. And they're just layers on layers. And it's taking a toll on us, on the people around us, the people that we love. We just have shorter fuses. And I know, gosh, I hope he's okay with me talking about this. I'm going to have to check this out with my husband before I release it. We've had to have more conversations about, he stopped going to the gym and now the gym on base is open. And because my mom lives with us, because I'm more conservative than my husband is, what kind of precautions are they taking? And what are his standards for what are acceptable precautions? Even today, we were talking about him doing an activity with somebody, and this person has a diagnosis. It's highly contagious. And So that brought up some concerns for me. And this is the part where I'm talking about where we tend to be more tense, that what my husband said is gesturing with his hands. He says, you're at this end of the continuum, at this extreme, pointing with one hand to one side and I'm at the other. What I heard was that I'm extreme in my need for precautions and he's not. Obviously, I stood up for myself and then had to cite examples where I felt like he was not being cautious to make my point. I raised my voice. I mean, in the moment, I felt like I was standing up for myself, that how can you say that I'm at an extreme and you're not? And after we talked it through, he was not indicating that I was at an extreme. He was showing that this is a continuum and I'm on one end of the continuum and he's at the other end of the continuum. I use this as an example because that was my protectiveness over my trait of being mindful and conscientious. And I care about, I feel like I'm being very mindful about what I'm doing. He is too. This is not to say that he's not conservative. And I've actually been pretty surprised at how he's chosen to respond based on how we are pretty different in things. But whatever he does outside of the house potentially impacts me when he comes home. And the same thing for me, that I chose to do something that felt like it was a higher risk behavior. And so I talked to him about it. But my point is that my need to defend and protect my sense of caution, obviously he was just showing that it was on a continuum. But what I heard was that I was, at an extreme and he wasn't. We're going to be more reactive these days. We're going to be a little bit more on edge. Maybe not always, maybe sometimes, but we really need to be able to take all of these factors into account. And the other two factors that I think are really important to talk about is when we have uncomfortable feelings, are we attaching danger to it or are we attaching curiosity? Do we assume that the person has our best interest in mind and give them the benefit of the doubt, or do we go to a place where we feel hurt and injured? And it's interesting what I can say in these newer relationships is I go to a secure place. With this friendship that I'm having some bumps in, I use my wounded lens to look at the relationship and I feel hurt and injured. How we interpret things is really going to determine our outcome. And when we are able to trust that people have our best interest in mind and we see the best in others, we have better outcomes. So that's one of the things. The other one is, oh Lordy, there's been a long pause and I can't remember what the other one is. I've had to start and stop this recording more times than I ever have. The dog's on my lap. She needs to get down. I closed the door. I closed the window because they had blowers next door. Part of me wonders if the universe is just telling me that I don't need to be talking about this or this is not the day to record. What I would invite you to do is to think about, in the relationships that you have that work, what are the things that you love about those relationships? What are the things that you really need to have in relationships? What are the things that are deal breakers? Then you can look at your relationships and see, are these newer relationships where there's not a lot of baggage? Are these older relationships where it's a little harder to tease out what's going on? What is it that you would like? Are you able to show up and be authentic in your relationships? How much of this is about your wounding, the other person's wounding? I wish that I could give you a clear and simple answer. I'm hearing banging next door too, and I'm wondering if that's going to show up in this recording. It's just one of those days, I guess. Relationships are complicated. This is not about being a highly sensitive person and we're difficult to be in relationships. Relationships in and of themselves are difficult, and there's always areas where we can grow and we can change, and we deserve to have satisfying, healthy, nurturing relationships. If there are parts of us that have wounding, we need to work on that, because it's like putting on glasses, as wounded glasses, and what we see, and we bring them into relationships. We can do hard things. We can get through this. If you need to get extra support, you can. Which leads me to talking about the online HSP courses. I have a couple people that are signed up right now. Today's date is September 8th, 2020. This should be released sometime this week if I get my stuff together. I have 3 people that have signed up for the online HSP course. It's on Mondays from 3 to 4:20 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I just need another couple of people. We'll go 6 to 8 people for this group. If you've been thinking about wanting to take this course, I would really encourage you to do that. I have a couple other days and times that I have the course offered. You can go to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com, go to the HSP groups page, and all of the information is there, and there's a registration form there too. These courses have been transformational, and on Tuesday, the 15th, you're going to hear from somebody that took the course, and I reached out to her because I needed some information from her, and she told me about changing careers and all of these things that happened after she took the online HSP course. It's just a really powerful story. And what we did with the last course that just finished up the last few weeks ago, we talked as a group initially about, do you want to be talking about what's going on in the world with COVID? If you're in the States, what's going on politically? We got a group census about what people wanted to talk about, what didn't feel comfortable. Whoever needs the most space gets it. And we were able to include that into the topics that we talk about. In the course, we cover things like mindfulness and self-compassion, perfectionism, boundaries, communication. I keep an 8x5 and I can't find it, or I'd read you everything that's in there. How to create a lifestyle that honors the HSP, looking at the negative messages that we get and turning them into superpowers. Because we internalize a lot of these negative messages and then we continue to reinforce them with ourselves. We spend a lot of time talking about relationships, and I've talked about this frequently, that we often need to get reality checks that we share, and we have that wound of too much or not enough. People would bring situations that they were struggling with to group, and we would talk about it as a group and give feedback. I can't guarantee the connection that you'll have in the group, but it really does create a safe environment where you can show up, be seen and heard. If you're someone who likes to hang back and not participate as much, you're an introvert where you're actively listening and participating, but you don't like to share as much, there really is no expectation. This group is really set up to honor our HS needs. If you need to eat, if you need to turn off the video, whatever it is that you need to honor yourself, but it really is a tremendous gift. Right now, I'm seeing more anxiety, more depression. We're experiencing loss. It's just a challenging time in the world, and it's much more affordable than working one-on-one with me. The courses are 10 weeks long. They meet for an hour and 20 minutes every week. They've just been transformational. If you're interested, you can go to my website. There's videos, there's little audiograms, there's podcasts you can listen to from people that have taken the course. I just think that they're really powerful. And if you're interested, check it out. The other thing that I would love to invite you to do is I have a survey for listeners of the podcast. And if you haven't taken the survey, you can go to unapologeticallysensitive.com. There's a tab that says surveys, or you can go to the contact me page, and at the bottom, there's a place where you can click through. This will help me get a sense of who you are so that I can create content that's going to be valuable, because I don't have a sense of what the demographics are. It's confidential. It's anonymous. I don't know who you are. You don't have to fill out all of the questions. It will also help me in getting sponsors for the podcast to have a little bit of a sense of who y'all are, because I don't really have a sense of that. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I know that this time in the world right now is challenging. It can be upside down. We can do hard things. We can get through this. If there's anything I can do to support you, please let me know. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.